Okay, so picking up from part one, where we were finishing this quotation about the Chinese implementation of science in education, he writes, we must be attentive and implement such public education as part of the strategy to modernize our socialist country and to make our nation powerful and prosperous. Ignorance is never socialist, nor is poverty. And he continues to now turn to America. During the 80s, when he was writing this, the Psychic Friends Network was a very popular business where people would call in and kind of get their tarot cards read or their palms read or some kind of fortune telling, and they would be paying a lot of money for this. And that this was actually kind of trickled down all the way from the top, where it was known that Nancy and Ronald Reagan actually relied on an astrologer, even in government matters. And he writes that as amusing as some of the pseudoscience may seem, getting your palm read as a way of knowing the future, as confident as we may be that we would never be so gullible as to be swept on this, we know that it's happening all around us. And so again, he gives other examples of transcendental meditation. He says a wide variety of solutions are offered. Some are limited, some are portentous. In the usual Darwinian natural selection of doctrines, some thrive for a time and then they vanish and then they come back after a little bit, right? He says the continuum stretching from ill-practiced science, pseudoscience, and superstition, whether it's new or old, all the way to respectable religion based on revelation is indistinct. So he's saying that the difference between astrology and meditation and believing in God and all of this is kind of all the same. I try not to use the word cult in its usual meaning of a religion, but try to reach for the headstone of knowledge. Do they really know what they claim to know? Everyone, it turns out, has some kind of relevant expertise. And then he talks specifically to God-focused religions, the theology, right, which is the study of God. He says that I'm critical of the excesses of theology because at the extremes, it's difficult to distinguish what is pseudoscience from actual doctrine and religion, right? Nevertheless, I want to acknowledge at the outset of diversity and complexity of religious thought that is practiced over the millennia. And he cites that there's all different kinds of religions that believe in God. There's Muslims, there's Catholics, there's Protestants, they are Jews. He said that though he was in contact with one religious leader who wrote to him and said that we've grown far too sentimental, devotionalism and cheap psychology on one side, and at the other is arrogance and dogmatic intolerance. Sometimes I come close to despair, but then I live tenaciously and always with hope. Honest religion, more familiar than its critics, is encouraging a healthy skepticism for purposes. There is a possibility for religion and science to forge a partnership against false science. Strangely, I think it would soon be engaged in almost opposing false religion. So even this religious leader felt like there's a way to incorporate science as part of the critical thinking of making sure that we understand what we believe. And he says that pseudoscience differs from erroneous science. Science thrives on errors that, when we have an error, we cut it away and then these false conclusions can fall away and then we do know it is truth. Hypotheses are framed so that they're capable of being disproved. A succession of alternative hypotheses is confronted by experiment and observation. Science really staggers towards improved understandings. And pseudoscience doesn't. Pseudoscience does the opposite, where hypotheses are often framed precisely so they're invulnerable to any experiment that offers a prospect of disproof. Practitioners are defensive. They get even angry to defend their beliefs. And here he gives us a physical understanding that, we have very good motor skills as human beings. When we're young, we stumble and fall. When we're old, we stumble and fall. But throughout the majority of our life, we're very capable of physical activity. But this kind of distorts our perceptions that we are very competent in other ways. For example, what we believe, what we can see. He says that we're kind of prone to optical illusions. Sometimes we hallucinate. Sometimes we get mistakes in numbers adding up. But this also doesn't teach us that we should not trust ourselves. In fact, we do trust ourselves even when we're kind of full of these errors. He writes that wisdom should lie in our understanding of our limitations. Shakespeare writes, for man is a giddy thing. That's where the stuffy, skeptical rigor of science has to come in, because we're kind of prone to flip-flop a bit. So perhaps the hardest distinction between science and pseudoscience is that science has a keener appreciation of our human imperfection than these other kinds of belief systems do. So if we teach only the findings and products of science, no matter how useful and even inspiring they could be, without communicating the method of science, now we're also kind of getting towards pseudoscience, where like Sagan believes it's really important for people to understand that the science should be trusted because of the method, not just the outcome or the end product. The distinction between science and pseudoscience is made for you. There's no perplexities needed to be muddled through in these kind of authoritative science regimes like Russia and China, where there is a very strict government control over what people should believe. Every notion becomes improbable, however improbable, becomes authoritative. So it's really important for any popularizer of science to make clear the actual torturous history of the great discoveries and misapprehensions, and occasionally the refusal by its own practitioners to kind of change direction. Many, perhaps most science textbooks for budding scientists tread lightly here. It's enormously easier to present in an appealing way the wisdom distilled from centuries of patient and collective interrogation of nature than to detail distillation apparatus like scientific rigor. The method of science, as stodgy and grumpy as it may seem, is really important, and even more important than the findings of science. And here he gives some other notes that he points to, and there are 3 different related articles that are attached, which are really interesting, where he talks about metaphysics, science, and religious practices, and also this other book published by Thomas Addy, A Candle in the Dark. So I do encourage you to read these other things, also about UFOs, which is really something that people are into now. But that is the core of what Sagan is writing about in this essay. He very firmly believes in science as kind of giving us answers, real answers to understanding who we are, what the universe is, and even by understanding that, kind of being able to see for ourselves or get a better feel of what direction we are going in by knowing our history